actually the equations were more lenient a little bit, I guess, for the men in terms of how that worked. And I think this all kind of came to light with some of the work I was doing with the female elite warfighters, because those women we know are very fit, and they happen to be the women that were in that 5%. When they came to do some research studies with me and we would tape them and then we'd throw them on the DEXA, it just didn't make sense that these are our MVPs of the Army and they're having this issue.
Hey team, welcome back to another week with Drew and Alex on the Drew and Alex Show.
Did we change the name of the podcast?
Yeah, Drew and Alex Show. I know I just mentioned this to you. I'm going to mention it to all the people. I'm absolutely miserable right now. It is Friday, August 30th.
Aren't you under a heat advisory?
Probably. It's like it's hot as hell. And I thought this morning that I would wake up early and play golf. So I did. And I teed off at like 7 a.m. and it felt fine. And then by the end of it, it had to have been the most humid morning of all time, which, whatever. Then I got home. And when I got home, so in front of my house, there's like a little culvert. And typically it's just kind of empty, but it was just like there was a river going down. It's like, what's going on? My neighbor's on the phone. Turns out the dude's installing fiber optic internet, busted the water main. And so I had no water. So I was like, great, I can't take a shower. So instead, I hopped on the paddleboard, went out to the lake behind my house and thought I would jump in. And that felt okay. But then I went to a coffee shop and just like smelled myself. It was just gross. So
You're having a rough day.
Well, yeah, but it's not even, well, it's just not 2 p.m. So we still got some, but I thought when I got home, like it would be fixed, and I got home not too long ago. Still not fixed.
Water main breaks do not get fixed fast.
Well, it's not gushing anymore. So I thought maybe
because they turned off the water to it.
Sure.
Which means now your whole neighborhood doesn't have any water and won't for a while, because those are like serious fixes. They have to like dig up the whole section and replace a section of pipe.
Yeah,
it's a big deal.
And shortly, I'm gonna have to get in the car and drive 3 hours to the mountains, smelling. Ooh. Yeah, nothing about this is good, and it's 100 freaking degrees outside, and it's humid.
What a day!
It's not a good day.
if you're wondering, here in Colorado, it's not that hot. My water does work, and we're good.
Yeah, but you're in Colorado, so
yeah,
could be
I don't
better.
Have to drive 3 hours if I want to get to the mountains. It's amazing.
It's fair. I'll give you that. Anyway, so that's me. Hopefully, by the time people listen to this on Sunday, well, I won't be back from the mountains till Monday. So hopefully, when I get back Monday, there's water. I don't know.
Fingers crossed. I don't know.
Who are we talking to
today? And that's a hard pivot. That we did not even connect.
Speaking
the
of
at all.
Well, here we go. When it's really hot and humid outside, I lose weight. And today's conversation is all about body composition. So who are we talking to today?
Before I introduce the guest, I have to slightly challenge you. Based on my understanding, when it's hot and humid out, you do sweat and lose water weight, but your body actually has to work less hard to maintain your core body temperature in the heat. So you actually save calories. So in terms of like burning fat or like losing mass, probably not the case. You actually like lose more if it's very cold outside and you're shivering, because shivering costs calories.
Yeah, but when I like the last couple of weeks with these heat advisories, when I work out, I can like wring out my clothes when I'm done.
Yeah, you're losing water, but you're not losing fat or muscle or
It's just not good. I'm just ready for fall. Like I'm over it.
Let's not continue to signal boost the misinformation that just like sitting in a sauna or being hot outside is an effective tool for weight loss. I think our guest would confirm that. I will contact her after this, and we will get the official research physiologist.
You're saying if it's cold, you lose weight? Versus if it's hot, you just...
Because it costs energy to shiver. It is your body burning extra calories to keep you warm. That is my understanding.
I mean, I don't not agree with you, but I'm sitting here, I can also smell myself, and it's just gross.
I'm not sure if it's like her specific thing, but her department is definitely responsible for like extreme climate, military performance stuff. So we can get a solid answer from somebody who really knows.
Well, there you go. Well, who is she?
Anyway, this week's guest, Dr. Holly McClung. Holly is a nutritional physiologist for the Military Performance Division at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine, USARIEM, in Natick, Massachusetts. She earned her Master's of Science in Nutritional Biochemistry from the University of New Hampshire and obtained her certification as a registered dietitian through coursework at Cornell University and the Cleveland Clinic. Holly is dual trained in nutrition and exercise physiology, holding certifications as a certified specialist in sports dietetics and a certified exercise physiologist. On the military performance team, Holly functions as a principal investigator, leading work in the female warfighter and special populations workspace. Her work group is focused on designing and implementing research to quantify and model individualized energy and nutritional needs of modern warfighters. As we'll focus on in half of this podcast, she led the Army's modern body composition study, and her research directly supported the 2023 update to the Army Body Composition Policy, AR 600-9. Holly has published more than 45 peer-reviewed publications and holds 2 patents on a mobile metabolic sensor system designed for personal use. Most recently, her attention has been on characterizing the physiological, metabolic, and cognitive profile of elite warfighters going through modern ranger training to determine whether differences exist between sexes, and that will be the back half of this episode. She has some really interesting forthcoming research that hasn't quite published yet, but we'll keep you guys posted on that. And most importantly, she is a member of Leg Tuck Nation.
She's also way smarter than us. And it's one of those guests where as you're reading all that off, it's like, what are we doing? She has no business talking to us. But no, you mentioned it. There's kind of 2 parts to this. We spend the first part talking about body composition and her work in that space. And then the second part talking about more of the female elite warrior or female elite warfighter work that she's doing, which I think we pointed this out in the episode, aligns very closely with our ongoing AWITA project, which for those that don't know is Ambitious Women in the Army. So a lot of crossover there.
I'm going to take this opportunity to appeal to some very specific members of the audience. And I'm honestly not sure how many of them even listen to the episodes. A couple of them have been on as guests, but I don't know if they listen. You will hear during the episode, Holly mention that she would send us an awesome video they have of these female elite warfighters just like dominating physical challenges to include leg tucks. And unfortunately, upon follow-up analysis, we have determined that we are not actually going to be able to get that video. And that is because it is video of human subjects research participants that did not provide their consent to have footage released. So if you are one of the few, if you are one of the women who participated in this study because you're a total badass, do me a huge favor, reach out to Holly, tell her, release the footage. The Army needs it. It's good for everyone.
Probably like a movement we could start there or something. So yeah, anyway, super interesting conversation. Very intelligent, very qualified guest. And hopefully by the time this comes out, my house has water. So enjoy. I'm going to start with a dumb civilian question because I want to know the history of Army body composition. Is that too broad?
The history? I don't know if I know all the history. I know
you know more than me.
Yeah, I mean, I can walk you back to maybe the 90s.
Sweet. Let's start in the 90s.
I think it was around 2002 when there was a requirement across all of the branches through a DOTI where they wanted all of the services to have a similar style of body composition. So everyone kind of had to align. And so prior to that, the Army had their own equation. From males, I think it was 2 sites. For women, it was 4 sites that actually included like the forearm and the wrist. And so at that point, kind of everything came together into what we know now, in terms of 2 sites for the males at the neck and the abdomen, and then the women having the waist, the neck, and the hips. And that all came from a 1984 study by the Navy, where they looked at sex-specific body composition equations using circumferences. And so the Army has always used the height for weight table. And so I think really the height for weight table is more of a manpower piece because it'll take a lot of time to measure every single soldier, multiple sites. And so if they kind of have this, larger kind of catch-all where they can push those soldiers on that maybe need a little bit of a more in-depth body composition look, they would go on for circumferences. If the height for weight checked out, then, that soldier could kind of pass and not have to go on and kind of move to the next stop, I guess, in the body composition world. So that all, I think, was around the 2002 update to Army body composition. But before that, in the late 90s, each branch kind of had their own way of doing business. As we are modern day, I think all the branches have been doing things differently, and we now have a working group that's looking at kind of doing something similar again, bringing everybody back to maybe a standard equation and way of measuring body composition, so it's fair across all of the services.
So I think we're going to have a few questions about the research basis for the previous standards and things like that. But before we go there, you brought up a topic that I want to address early in this episode, which is the screening table is just a manpower time-saving instrument. And the thing I need people to hear, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the thing I've been trying to message to people is that needing to get taped, so screening into getting taped based on the table, is not a value judgment. It does not say anything about your body composition. It does not say anything about your fitness level. It is not something that should be viewed negatively. It means you have tested positive for having mass. It does not discriminate what kind of mass that is, right? Like that's it. Yeah, like you have a bunch of mass. Now we need to find out whether that mass is muscle or fat. That's it. And I think that's less of an issue on the men's side. I don't think men seem to be too bothered by needing to get taped. I think because of a variety of things in our culture in terms of like what women think they're supposed to look like or whatever, women seem to be more concerned when they have to get taped, even if they pass that tape. And I think that comes back to some misunderstanding around the screening table.
Correct. The screening table is a simple screening tool. No one fails the body composition because they fail the height for weight. It's just like the first stop. There's three, now there's 3 levels, but the first stop is height for weight, and it's purely for screening. So it shouldn't equal anything else.
Can I ask, and I mean, I don't know, maybe you have the answer to this, and maybe this is going back too far, but I'm just curious why, or rather, what sort of spurned this need for the branches to start to consider anthropometrics? I mean, because again, time and again on this podcast, we talk about sort of physical culture and the history of, the military and World War I, World War II, et cetera. And I mean, I've never seen that come up. It would seem like in the 90s, maybe something happened socioculturally that made us start measuring people's body composition. I get the reasons for it now because we're dealing with an obesity epidemic and sure, but did something happen that made the branches start to think that we need to be looking at people's body composition?
I think it's always been more of a health of the soldier. So how they perform their job, long-term preventative health of the soldier, and also, how they look in their uniform. I don't know the exact history. I know that it was, I think, in the 1960s, maybe. But I think that, I do think that some of it had to do with maybe the soldiers not weighing enough. I'm not 100% sure, but I definitely can go back. But I think it's definitely shifted. And like the current 1990s, 2000 is more, making sure that we're taking care of the soldier in terms of their health and their performance, because we know that body composition plays a role in long-term health of the soldier, warfighter.
I think it was I think you said 1984 Navy study that a lot of this was based on. Since we're about to transition into talking about the study you led, I'm curious how strong the evidence basis was for some of these early iterations of body composition policy. Like what populations were studied, how large were they? Did they account for some of the different anthropometry stuff? Because for people who don't know, like anthropometry is a whole field of study, and it's really hard to boil it down to a chart that works for everyone.
Right. Great question. And so the early, first of all, and when we think back to the 1980s, think about what the US looked like in terms of diversity, and then what the Army looked like. And so I don't think that it was a huge concern, that, that they definitely, I don't think they prioritized. I think there were two different studies that came out. I think that the male group might have had some diversity. The female group did not, and it was much smaller. Again, this was work that the Navy did, so I'm definitely not an expert on it. I've just read the studies. But I think that when we look at our modern day world, specifically like the US, like we're much more diversified than we were in the 80s. So it's definitely something that we needed to pay attention to and make sure that every soldier is represented in this policy, because that's, the way that the Army does business is one size fits all. There's not an MRE specific for every single individual. There's not an Army body composition policy for specific ethnicities, ages, race.
So fast forwarding now to present day and the massive effort that you undertook, the Army Comprehensive Body Composition Study, the ACBC. Can you lay that out and give people, let's assume they don't know anything about it. Can you give us kind of the background and just the sheer scale of what you undertook?
Sure. Yeah. Really, this kind of came as a tasking from CIMT and TRADOC that came down from the Army senior leaders. It was at the time that they were making decisions about the ACFT becoming the performance test of record. There was a lot of questions that Army senior leaders couldn't find answers to in terms of if we are asking soldiers to work out differently, because now there's 6 different events, and how is this going to affect soldiers' bodies? Do we need to take a look at that body composition policy? And so USARIEM had been involved in some of the studies in the early 2000s when they had transitioned to the most current Army equations that they use for body comp estimation. And we didn't have updated data that we could answer the questions. And so USARIEM is really unique in that we are able to kind of go out into the field with our study team and collect really difficult data in short periods of time. It's kind of our bread and butter. So it was a perfect tasking for us. The time period was very short. I think we got the official tasking in maybe January of 2021 or 2021. And they wanted the data in like 6 months. And so in order for us to really do it right, we needed to take our time and we needed to look at what the current Army looked like. So we needed to work to get the demographics from the Pentagon. What's the breakdown of sex, within sex, age, ethnicity, race, even some of the physical demand categories and rank, so that we could make sure that when we're designing the study, we were designing a study that would statistically represent the Army. So what that means is if we draw conclusions from our study sample, we can kind of extrapolate that's how it would affect the Army. And so we spent a good amount of time, and one of my my key right hand person, Katie Taylor, actually is a research epidemiologist, and so she really had a great grasp on large data sets. And we modeled how we were going to sample the Army, just how the National Institute of Health does their annual examination of the US population. So how do they figure out those samples? So that's exactly what we did with the Army. So if you can imagine kind of bins for every female category, age then was broken down by ethnicity. And we tried to get rank and physical demand categories diversified too. So there's all these bins. I think there was over 45 bins of people that we needed to fill. And then depending on what the percentage of those people or those soldiers made up the Army, it was how many people were in each one of those bins. And so the way that it worked for us is we knew that we wanted to compare the old circumference manual tape measure to some modern technologies. And so we looked at what's, kind of currently out there in terms of H2F funded units. They're using BIA or bioelectrical impedance to look at percent body fat using the in-body 770s. So we use those. We knew we wanted to use dual energy X-ray absorptometry, which is the DEXA scanner, because we know that's probably the most accurate besides underwater weighing. It's something we could take into the field. Really expensive units. We knew the Army couldn't afford those, but we knew we could use that as kind of our gold standard or criterion measure to kind of bring everything back and compare to. And then out of interest, we've been using these 3D total body surface scanners, which the Navy has also been using, just in our research to understand, different measurements of the warfighter. And it also would give us a huge data set if we needed to develop a new equation. So for each scan, which takes like 90 seconds, there's 250 measurements. So 250 measurements of lengths, circumferences really would be helpful if we needed to kind of go back comparing to the DEXA, which measurements are most closely correlated with a soldier's body fat. And then, of course, we wanted to ask some questions about injury, be able to get access to every soldier's, their medical profile just related to musculoskeletal injuries. And for the women, we were interested in if they had had children, any of the maternal health. So in a nutshell, that was our study. We asked soldiers to come listen to a briefing. If they were interested in volunteering, they would come right into the room next door and go through a bunch of different stations through each one of these assessments with our study team. And hopefully they would be done with us in 2 to 3 hours with everything. And we would they were excited to participate because they got to walk away with some of their own information in terms of, their body composition, which that workup, was expensive. We did tape each individual soldier at 4 sites. So we taped men and women exactly the same. So if you were a male, you had your neck, your waist, your abdomen, so over your belly button, and your hips taped. And same thing for women. So we had those manual circumferences for both men and women exactly the same.
All right. I have some slightly rapid fire questions. Hopefully they don't turn into long conversations, but follow-up questions on the study, how it was conducted and the results and things like that. One, is this one of, if not the largest study of its nature that has been done? Maybe specific to the military, maybe not.
So it's definitely the largest, most diverse population. There have been some pretty close population sizes, but not that are as demographically diverse as this. So this is the only study that's actually statistically represented the Army in terms of the way that we sample. That's the really unique thing about it. And then, of course, the size of the population is in the thousands. I think we had close to 3,000 soldiers total that we assessed. But going into the equations, I think we used around 2,200.
All right. Next one. I know from my previous talks you've given and things like that multiple peer-reviewed publications are likely to come from this. I have to admit my own failure to prepare properly for this episode. We've been trying to do this one for a long time. And between when I invited you and now, one of those papers has been published. It looks like there's an April 2024 publication from you and your team. I'll link that in the notes for people who want to check it out. But can we expect additional publications coming out of this?
Yeah, so that equation, Katie Taylor was the lead author on, and that was in Obesity Science and Practice. And that's just the science behind the equation. The actual study and all the outcomes in terms of the body composition of the Army is in a publication that we're in the final stages of that will hopefully come out from the International Journal of Obesity. And we're hoping this fall, any day now, we should hear, hopefully.
Awesome. We'll be looking forward to it. Next one. This study obviously involved a few different tech options. We've had this conversation with other folks in the human performance space about the difficulty of keeping up with wearable technology as it advances. Do you foresee any challenges now that we've tied ourselves to a specific piece of technology, knowing that BIA will likely continue to advance, new options might come on board? You guys looked at 3D body scanning, and that's still pretty early. That might become more advanced in the future. Do you foresee challenges with keeping up with tech now that we've brought it into this policy world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty of the two Army directives that kind of came out of the science is that it's multifaceted. There's kind of three different levels. The first being the ACFT exemption, so performance being linked in. The second, the new equation, and in that directive, we also put the option for a soldier, if they fail based on the new circumference equations, they can go on and use a modern technology. I can see that piece of the policy being updated if needed, based on new, versions or new technologies that come out. I think we have 3 listed right now in that Army Directive 2023-11 or 2023-11. But I think just like any Army policy, there should be, a regular review and update. I think, at some point, there will be a shift again in the population of the U.S., a shift in the Army. So I think you just gotta, it's science isn't stagnant. Like, you have to keep up with it.
And then you mentioned it already in there, but the ACFT 540 exemption, how did we come to land on the 540 number? What was the process there?
Right. So we asked soldiers that participated in our study to self-report, but we actually, because we also asked for access using their DoD ID numbers to go in and pull their unit provided scores. And so those are what we used with their percent body fat from the DEXA, which was the most accurate body fat measurement that we used for assessment. We were able to kind of look at what the threshold was for where body fat, musculoskeletal injury, and ACFT kind of all came together. So there's actually, in the paper that's coming out, there's a really nice figure that kind of shows how all 3 of them came together. And first we looked at like a total score. And then we looked at, is it easier to look at by event if it was, a soldier getting 90% or 90 points out of 100 in each event. And we found kind of the sweet spot was to prevent musculoskeletal injuries, maintain a healthy body composition, scoring at least 80 points in each of the 6 events, and then a total of a 540. And that was really, thanks to Katie Taylor and her ability to take the data and model it. And that's something that we would not have been able to do if we weren't, kind of thoughtful in the design, and also having access at USARIEM. We have access to this great, we call it the Sphere database. It's allows us to pull unit scores as well as some of the medical information.
I do have one direct question, and it's why were the specific pieces of technology used in the study? We're looking at DEXA, 3D body scan, InBody 770. Why and how were those selected? And my hard piece of the question is, why the InBody 770 specifically, when we have pretty good research out there that there are competitor products that are both cheaper and more accurate in the bioelectrical impedance market?
So we'll see if Colonel Reddy's okay with this. I think we chose the InBody. Number one, we already use it in some of our research at USARIEM. And then number 2, it's currently what was in those H2F units. So if we decided that, the BIA was the way to go, we already would have data to support that. Because I know the other question, a lot of people ask, why don't we use the bod pods? Because those are some on the wellness centers. The accuracy of the research grade InBody 770 is pretty close to the circumference accuracy when you look in the literature, whereas the bod pod had a little bit of a larger range. But in terms of specific manufactured BIA, that's why we went with the InBody. It's just, number one, we had them on hand and they were already in H2F supported units.
I am curious, and this is Holly, this isn't directed to you, it's more of just a conversational thing, because like Alex mentioned, we've had a similar discussion in the past with wearables and tech. I mean, everybody I think acknowledges that tech is becoming synonymous with human performance these days. And it is curious when you think about these different rollouts. I mean, Alex with Space Force, me with the Army. I mean, Space Force, you guys are basically tying your PT stuff to wearable tech. So I'm curious, maybe the question here is from like a research standpoint, how do you keep emerging human performance findings separate from tech? So much so that like, sure, we could use a particular device when we conduct a study, but it does have to be device agnostic when we put it into policy. But certain devices are required to find certain findings, I would think, unless I'm wrong.
I feel like this is above my pay grade.
It may be, it may be.
I think I definitely would come to Army senior leaders with recommendations, but I needed to be grounded and remember that we have millions of soldiers and they're in forward operating locations where we can't ensure that they're going to have the same thing as soldiers that are back in garrison. And so we needed to have options that were field expedient and also that were cheap because we needed to think about compost 2 and 3. And that's another piece I didn't mention is that we're one of the few, we could be the only study, I'm not 100% confident, that looked at statistical sampling and how the effects of these new policy changes were going to affect Reserve and National Guard. And those are a big part of the Army and oftentimes kind of get forgotten when the policy is put together. And so I know working really closely with the Army senior leaders that they wanted to make sure that whatever was rolled out, that they were going to have buy-in from Compo 2 and 3.
That's fair. And actually, speaking of, so I'll go in the complete opposite direction now because we're talking about complex technology. Now I want to ask you a question about the new algorithm because it relies on only one measurement, whereas before there were other measurements. And we've been asked this before, people talk about it. You would assume that reducing the number of measurements would reduce the accuracy, but that actually isn't the case. Can you speak to that?
Right. Well, what's really unique and the publication that Alex kind of brought up, when we developed the equation, we developed it specific to the Army. So we basically took, the 3D body scans and racked and stacked those 250 measurements and saw what was most closely correlated with soldiers' body fat. And then from those top few sites, we look to see what are kind of have a landmark. We don't want something that's really difficult in the field or for someone that's not an expert in anthropometrics or, performance, nutrition or physiology to be able to find. So we could have made a much more complex equation and we made many versions of the equation. We did include height in one of our versions. We did include 2 sites. And what we found is they didn't make it any more accurate because we really had a really rich data set to work with. And so that's why I say, I think, in maybe 10 years, we might want to go out and do a similar study like this because we might need to tweak that equation and update it to however the Army has changed. But I don't think necessarily the number of sites matter when you, as a researcher, when you're looking at, I want to be able to characterize my study population, you pick a body composition method that works best for your population, whether it's an equation or a technology. For instance, for older folks, they're often dehydrated. So you need to consider that in terms of their total body water. BIA might not be the best for them. So when we think about the Army, it doesn't necessarily matter how many sites. It matters if the equation accurately represents them. And we know that it does because we went out and collected a couple hundred extra soldiers just to test the equation at Fort Stewart after we had developed it, just to triple check that it was doing exactly what we had hoped it would do with a brand new population, because we had data sets that we tested it on, but I felt like when we were rolling out something so big that was going to impact every single soldier, I didn't want to have a second guess. So I think the bottom line is that when you pick a body composition equation to estimate, you really want to marry it up with your population. And this one really is built for the Army. If someone was going to use it in the Navy or the Marine Corps, we might just want to double check that it works and functions as well as it does in the Army.
I will speak directly to the audience again one more time and then let Holly correct me if I'm wrong. But I know some people have messaged me and expressed a little bit of confusion about the way the algorithm works because they've noticed that if your weight goes up, your body fat percentage goes down. If nothing else changes and weight goes up. And I want to clarify, That is correct. Like that's how density works. If your circumference stays the same, but your mass is higher, that mass is more dense and therefore more likely to be muscle. Am I
Correct.
getting that right? Okay.
You got it. Yeah.
Okay. And then a couple fast ones before we transition to a research I think you're actually more hyped on, the female elite warfighter stuff. I know some of these graphics have been briefed, but I wanted to ask you, can you compare the old method to the new one, old algorithm and method to new algorithm and method in terms of how often they over or underestimate soldiers' body fat percentages? And then specifically, do those rates of over and underestimation vary between men and women?
Okay. Good question. Okay. The question that I get a lot also. So, you know, despite popular belief, the old equations weren't doing an awful job. So when you look at overall across the Army population, it did a pretty good job of not overestimating soldiers' body fat, with only about 1% of soldiers kind of inaccurately failing the tape test. But what we did find is when we started to kind of look at that data and portion it out by sex and age, ethnicity, we started to kind of see there was a gap kind of happening between. And so we did find that females were more likely to inaccurately fail the tape test as compared to men. It was, I think we found like around 5% of women would be inaccurately taped. And so basically what we did is we looked at those women that were manually taped in our study and what was their percent body fat on the DEXA. And then based on 600-9 policy requirements for their age, would they have passed or would they have failed? So we kind of looked at that as like chi-square statistical analysis, like to see like what does it look like? And women just actually the equations were more lenient a little bit, I guess, for the men in terms of how that worked. And I think this all kind of came to light with some of the work I was doing with the female elite warfighters, because those women we know are very fit. And they happened to be the women that were in that 5%. When they came to do some research studies with me and we would tape them and then we throw them on the DEXA, it just didn't make sense that these are our MVPs of the Army and they're having this issue. So I think the new Army body composition does a much better job. I mean, nothing is going to be 100%. It's not the DEXA. But it overall, underestimation is the same across men and women. And then when we put in the piece of the ACFT meeting the 540, and if a soldier is allowed to kind of petition and go on to get a BIA or a DEX or something like that, it kind of removes all of that inaccuracy of failing. So I think kind of building in a couple different steps really helped make the equation across the board more accurate for everyone. Does that answer the questions? Does it make more questions?
Well, I have a question that, I mean, we've touched on this a couple of times, just the fact that the new policy, you've got a couple fail safes if you do fail tape. And I'm curious, how common is it for someone to fail tape, but then pass on one of the alternatives, like one of the in-bodies or any of the different tech?
So I don't know if I have that number off the top of my head, but I guess I would say if you are passing, so you're saying if you fail with taping, but then you passed, so you're being overestimated. So with a new body comp, it's about 1-ish% for men and 2-ish% for women. But most of those women, when we looked at our study sample, were folks that were high performers. So they were probably going to not get the exemption, not even have to go on to body fat assessment.
So the likelihood that somebody is scoring below 540 on the ACFT and getting above tolerance on the tape test, but is actually within tolerance on body fat is actually very low.
Very low. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to put that out there for people who think that like the tape is lying to them and that the in-body is going to save them or something.
Basically, if you fail tape and you don't have above a 540, you're wrong.
Yeah. So it's the underestimation would be people that are, are inaccurately passing, right? Like, so the skinny fat,
Dad bods.
that's like a really hard one.
Dad bods?
Well, that's just a hard one in terms of circumference, like for us to get away with. We would have loved to do something with lean body mass in the equation, but again, when we're looking about field efficiency and making sure that compo 2 and 3, like that's really hard to do without a technology to measure someone's lean body mass versus body fat. But this new equation does much better in terms of underestimating. So people that shouldn't be passing, are passing. Overall, it's 25%. I think that happens. 25% of men, 24% of women. Whereas in the old equation, it was 33% of men and 19% of women. So now we've really leveled the playing ground between men and women. So that there's not much we can do about that underestimation, but the equation is we always wanted to develop an equation that was working in the favor of the soldier. We would rather err on the side of underestimating them and than overestimating them. And so that was, one of the stipulations of the new equation.
Can I ask you a dumb question? Well, I'm going to ask you a dumb question. And if you can tell me to shut up, but I'm curious, we have the ACFT and we talked about the 540, and I think that makes intuitive sense for a lot of people. Like if you can score above a certain number, and you sort of mentioned some of the science tied into that for justification purposes, is there a world where you could just do away with Army body composition policy entirely and just tie everything to performance? I mean, because 540 and above, great. Could you like stratify that to different performance metrics and say, I don't really care what you look like as long as you can hit X or Y or Z? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely more research that's needed. This question has come up. I think as a nutritional physiologist, background as dietitian, like I think body composition is important because it also helps maintain a healthy soldier. So part of our job as the Army is to make sure that we're taking care of the future soldier, right? The soldier 20 years down the line. So if you are able to work out and get that 600 on your ACFT when you're 18, when you're 24, but then you get injured, right? I think it's a whole holistic approach. And I think body composition and performance, I think it makes sense to have them together in the policy. But I think it doesn't make sense to not have them both, I think you can't just have performance, because you need to think about, the long-term effects. Like there's a whole slew of science out there that looks at metabolic syndrome and, folks that are overweight and how that impacts the long-term health. As, being overweight as a young adult, I think you're like 95% likely to be overweight as an older adult. And so I think we needed to think about taking care of our soldiers.
Okay, I'm convinced. That was fair. Fair play.
So, Holly, you already identified kind of the topic that's going to help us transition from body composition to female elite warfighters, and that is that a specific population, and it was anecdotal for me, but now you've done research on this, the specific population that seems to be most frequently mistreated by the old approach to body composition testing was muscular women. Women like who were capable of doing the things we were looking to do when we removed the gender limiter on serving in combat roles and things like that. And I just want to give you a chance to lay out, like, how was that a big problem? How big a problem was it? How common was this popping up? And how did that shape the approach you've taken to this female elite warfighter demographic?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think in terms of prevalence in elite female warfighters, I don't know that I exactly have a number. I have a small sample that I've looked at in my research, and I think 20% is reasonable. And I think this actually came up in kind of an off the cuff conversation with SMA Grinston when he happened to be at USARIEM, and he was, I think, in the midst of dealing with all the ACFT, and I think he was interested to hear this because I think we have a ton of data on basic trainees. We don't have a lot of data on mid and late career soldiers. And so that was, I think, talking to him and him realizing, like, I mean, we need to look at the whole Army, and we need to better understand how the body composition affects each and every soldier. And it's easy to study BCT because they're a captive audience. It's harder to get a 50-year-old officer to come in and give us, 3 or 4 days of their time so that we can research them. So that was one of the really important pieces of the body composition study. For the elite female warfighters, it was just kind of hearsay. We didn't really know for sure. But around 2019, I was really interested, and I couldn't believe as a scientist that no one had really looked at those first pioneer women that went through Ranger School. And so I kind of wanted to know how, what are these women all about? They're rock stars that broke the glass ceiling for integration into this really difficult combat leadership course. Like, I'm assuming they're awesome performers. What is their psychosocial, background? What do they look like in terms of body size and physique, like just their outline and their shape? So we brought them to USARIEM. We recruited, I think at the time when I wrote the study, there was only 8 women that had graduated from Ranger School. I don't think we had any from Marine Infantry Officer, no SEALs. But we kind of cast the net and we asked women that had graduated from any of those 3 schools if they were interested in coming for an all-paid trip to USARIEM for a couple of days so that they could be tested and be part of kind of understanding these pioneer women. I think by the end of the study, there were around maybe 25, 40 women that had graduated. Now we have more than 175. So those very first few women, we called it the few female elite warfighters. We had them kind of go through the gamut. We did put them on the treadmill. We did VO2 max tests. We assessed their body composition using all the methods we used in the body composition study that we just spoke about. And we had them go through a one-on-one interview so we could learn a little bit more about kind of what makes up the person that they are in terms of their, their ability to take on these big challenges, their grit, their resilience, their hardiness. And I think, after spending some time with these women and realizing how, fit they are physically and mentally, to see that they had the challenge of standing in the line to get taped after they just, had aced their PT test, just didn't make sense. And so I think that I was grateful to get the ear of an Army senior leader and be able to go out and maybe do something to help, especially all women, but especially women mid-career, late career, that I feel like we just didn't have data on.
So this is probably an evolving thing as different roles get integrated and things like that. Who officially qualifies as a female elite warfighter? What boxes do you have to check to
It's like a cool title.
Go to the study and get assessed?
You get a badge.
Yeah. So the original study that I was talking about, we recruited women that had graduated within the last 5 years. So the first 5 years of combat leadership course, they were graduates. So that would have been the Ranger course, Marine Infantry Officer, or SEALs. And so we had 1 Marine and we had 12 Rangers that came and participated. It was during COVID, so it was really difficult to get folks to come, but I feel grateful that those women kind of just donated their time. They had to quarantine with us. They had to quarantine when they went back. It was a nightmare to do science during COVID. But we kind of, for the purposes of my research, we call a female elite warfighter a graduate of one of the combat leadership courses. So, SF, I actually have a study coming up with them this fall to also look at those women. I think there's a real interest in Army senior leaders of better understanding these women, because I think the key to real integration is to increase the numbers and maintain. And I think, we have a high attrition of women, kind of once they go through some of these trainings, maintaining a career in some of these, more difficult roles.
How do these female elite warfighters compare, maybe from a scientific perspective, but maybe just anecdotally, to sort of the averages that you see across the force?
Yeah, so when we looked at, we call them the few, when we looked at the original few, we
That's
found
beautiful. I love that you've done that.
they were much more fit when we looked at like an average female in the Army, more comparable with the men, and in many cases more fit with the men in specific events when we look at just averages. So when they came, I mentioned we put them on the treadmill and we did a VO2 max because that would allow me to compare them to athletes. So when we look at some of in terms of like endurance or marathon athletes, if they were heavier, but their absolute VO2s were pretty similar. And then if we look at like in terms of their lean body mass, the few were comparable with like a culmination of Olympic athletes, kind of put together more like a strength athlete in terms of the amount of lean body mass that they had. But performance wise, they're superior to their female peers that are on average in the Army, most comparable with men.
Are there, maybe this is like a made up thing, but like, are there benchmarks or metrics you would think that a woman needs to hit to become one of the few? Is there a few test?
There is not a few tests. Maybe that's something I should put together. To me, I think graduating from one of these really difficult integrated combat courses kind of shows that a female is elite, just like an elite male soldier. I think a lot of what we learned from our first study was that what made the few unique was really kind of what was between their ears, like their motivation, their grit. They're just really gritty, resilient, hardy women. And for them to go in to say a Ranger, unit and be the only female and be able to lead and be successful says something about them. So I don't think it's necessarily a physical performance benchmark or body composition benchmark. I think it's kind of the whole package. And I think if you go through these really difficult trainings, you're testing your body, your mind, I think everything that composes you. So I think that's an elite warfighter, whether you're female or male.
At risk of maybe rephrasing the exact same question I just asked you, from like a human perspective, looking past the science, was there like a common background or a common narrative that you noticed come up more often than not when you kind of on aggregate look at all of these women? Was there like a something that stood out as like, okay, there's a common thread here? I don't know exactly what it is, but something is speaking to me about maybe the background of these women.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons we had like a guided one-on-one interview. Myself and one of my colleagues met with them and kind of went through the same questions for each female. And we put together a really nice paper, just kind of better understanding like the psychosocial makeup of the women and the patterns across. Most of the women had overcome some kind of hardship growing up. And so we feel like that kind of helped build their psychological stamina. They had very similar ways of like defining themselves. Like if you ask them to just define themselves in one word, a lot of them use very similar words. And as you might think, you would say they said competitive, but they were very quick to define not competitive with each other, but competitive with themselves. They were always trying to level up. So for instance, they finished Ranger school. A couple of them were very like depressed, like what's next? What's the next hardest thing I can do? They just like thrive off challenge. And that was something when we compared them to male elite warfighters, their striving, I don't even know what you call it, but their level of challenge was so much higher than men. Like they just they just thrive off it. So that was really unique. They also had all the women had really strong male mentors throughout their life. And I'm not sure if that's because there aren't a lot of female mentors in the military, or in, necessarily in their time in life, in their lives, that were doing great things that they could look up to. I think that's one area that, we all as women need to do a better job of, like, mentoring and, making sure there's a seat at the table for the women coming up behind us. But those are some of just kind of the unique, like, psychological characteristics that we were able to kind of pull out. And I think that those are more, kind of more interesting than, less expected than some of the physical outcomes.
You just did a great job of laying out why psychological factors might be more important than physical factors, but this is a physical fitness oriented
Alex
podcast.
wants a few tests. Give us a few tests.
I won't try and nail you down on questions you already answered, but we just released a podcast a few days ago talking about, in part, non-failure thresholds, like identifying what level people need to be at, not to win. Like, it's not the max to strive for, but it's the floor you have to be above to not have an undue risk of failure. And I know you specifically studied in this work women who had graduated. So we don't get to compare the women who tried and didn't graduate to the women who went and did graduate. So we don't get that easy comparison. But looking at the data you do have, was there anything that stood out as like a physical capability way outside the norm that was most important, right? Like, you talked about VO2 max a little bit. It sounds like that might be one of them. But like any variable you tested, any component of fitness where they were clearly and consistently across this group of women way outside where you would expect them to be.
Just to clarify, so comparing to their army peers.
Yeah, compared to average or whatever you want to call that.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I mean, so their VO2s were in the superior range. In terms of strength, some of the things that we tested them for, like kind of military specific performance training, that we had other data sets we could compare them to. We had them do the long jump, the casualty drag, which is 123 kilogram dummy that they have to carry, and the 4-mile loaded ruck. The women were outstanding at the ruck, and a lot of them said, that is something that's always been kind of their go-to. They knew, like, when they went to Ranger school, they knew they didn't need to worry about the cut point because they were just really great ruckers. And so I don't know if that is something, I would definitely, this is just off the cuff, like, I'm not really sure, but I think that maybe, the shape of women's bodies and their hips and their ability to carry, if it's a similar load to men, like, I'm not sure. I definitely think the women outperformed their peers in all of the performance tests that we had. But I think that the range was a little bit wider for the ruck, and definitely the casualty drag. And so the casualty drag is really a lot of upper body fitness. And so we did notice that many of the women were involved in sports in college and in high school that involved upper body, whether it was gymnastics, crew, upper body strength, I think gives you a big advantage.
So I just want to highlight one there for the audience who might not catch. She talked about rucking plenty. She laid out the casualty drag in kilograms, and I want to convert it for our American audience here. That's a 271 pound dummy drag, 271 pounds. And the reason I want to highlight that is so when I was teaching the Master Fitness Trainer course, we had a combat focused assessment day where you did a bunch of tasks that simulated combat requirements. And one of those was always a sled drag. Depending on where we were, we would play with the weight a little bit because wet grass is different than turf, is different than a kind of gravel lot and things like that. But like roughly, it tended to be in the 180 to 200 pound range to get the level of difficulty we were looking for. And for a lot of people, that's fine. There was a subpopulation. It tended to be smaller people, and it did tend to be women, where their day got absolutely ruined by 185 pound, 50 meter sled drag. And you're you're pointing out here that these women performed particularly well on a 271-pound sled drag. And I want people to hear that because this is one that, like, the ACFT only does, the ACFT only does 90 pounds. I think somewhere in soldier training should be dragging heavy sleds. It's just kind of part of the deal of extracting a casualty.
Why is it 90 pounds? That seems like an absurdly low number. That's a probably totally different conversation.
Question for a different person, probably.
So, Alex, the other thing is the dummy is so hard. Like,
Yeah,
I don't know. When I say
extremely
it's like
awkward.
it's all floppy and it's like sand. So it's not easy. Like you kind of have to have a strategy. And so I just remember the first one or two women that came to USARIEM and they were just like killed it. And that is the woman I want standing next to me. I want to videotape that and show it to any male soldier that is nervous about having a female in their unit because they're just like animals. Like they are so strong. And I mean, they outperform many men, you know, when we look at like, you know, the numbers compared to like average men, like they were in the upper range of what males in the Army for how quickly they perform that task.
I do want to clarify there too, because I said sled drag and you're talking about dummy as though it's probably not on a sled in your test.
Human shape.
And anybody here who's
Human
like messed
shape.
around, yeah, anybody here who's messed around with the rescue Randys,
Mhm.
like a 270-pound Randy not loaded on a sled.
It's obnoxious.
I don't care if you're a man or a woman. I don't care how big or small you are. That is a hard thing to move
But
quickly.
but Holly, my question is, would that rescue Randy pass ABCP based on your new algorithm? Because if
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. I have to measure his circumference around his abdomen.
right,
But
because if
and the
not,
other
he
thing
wouldn't
is
be on the
like
battlefield, right?
this is true. Well, you never know. He might have had a medical profile or something.
That's fair. Real world, very real world.
Real world, but yeah. So the women are full in their full kit too. I mean, so that's another thing is when you're doing some, you know, you're sometimes in your PTs depending on when you're doing, you know, trainings, right?
So you said you don't have like a few tests with specific standards, but we've started to lay it out. You want to start doing the few tests. You're probably going to have to do a long ruck. You're probably going to have to do a treadmill progressive exercise VO2 max test, and you're probably going to have to put your kid on and drag a 270-pound
Find
rescue
a
Randy.
fat friend and just drag him around.
That's right.
Sort of working towards closers here. I'm curious, and I'll leave this kind of wide open to you. It can be body composition, it can be few, it can be both. But what areas in either of those camps most excite you in terms of future research, questions that you have unanswered? Like, where do you want to go with some of these things?
I'm very grateful to have been the lead for the Army for the body composition study. I feel like as a scientist, that's once in a lifetime to be able to have your science actually go into policy that affects soldiers. Like I could probably just retire now. But my real passion is to really help female soldiers and warfighters. And I love the work that I do. I feel that I'm hopefully making a difference. And I think that as all scientists, that's something that, you know, our goal is to help, you know, in my case, the performance and the optimization of women. And I think I focus on the elite just because I think it's still fresh. There's less than 10 years since women are in some of these, you know, combat roles, and there's a lot of questions. You know, like how do they perform at altitude? Do we need to look at their hydration status and update that policy? There's just like so many questions. So I want to do the best that we can do for our Army women, and so I think that's where I am right now. And, you know, we actually have a effort at USARIEM where we're focused on the female warfighter and research and kind of trying to cross the aisle to all the other services and network because we're so far behind, not just in the military, but in the scientific world in general on women, because women are more difficult to study because of our hormones and our menstrual cycles. And so I think for years and years and years, no one has studied women. And there's just a lot of catch up that we need to do. And so I feel that the time is now. I know sitting on a NATO panel where the focus is menstrual health and just better preparing our NATO women for all of these, you know, areas that we don't have information. So I think I always say, and my team kind of makes fun of me that, science is a team sport. And I think it's a team sport across all the services and across like our NATO nations to catch up for women. And so I think that that's kind of my goal. And however long I continue to do science, and I think as long as it's exciting and I feel like I'm making a difference, like I hope that I'll continue to get funded and be able to do work with these great women.
I hadn't even thought about that until you mentioned it. The NATO piece. Are there other sort of allied nations that stand out in terms of the efforts that they've conducted for women in general or for the elite warfighter population?
So we are tied in with the IDF, so Israeli Defense Force, as well as the UK. Norway, they integrated their women well before us. They have some interesting research out there, and we also work with them, not as closely, but definitely have some insight in what they've done. And I think that we kind of are all at the same point in time. So I think being able to kind of work together to answer the questions is kind of where we are right now, just networking, finding each other, and then divide and conquer.
Who has the scariest, most intimidating women, female soldiers? Has anyone ever walked into your, I mean, I could be wrong here, like into your lab, and you're just like, holy shit.
Surprisingly, most of the women, well, they all look very fit, but I think, kind of like CrossFit fit, like, women are fit. But all of the women are very attractive. Like, I think that it's interesting because sometimes people are surprised, that they're Rangers. Because if they don't have their head shaved, they aren't just a couple months out. Like, you can't necessarily tell. But most of them, like when I look at like the profile of women that were successful, they all have a similar kind of, just like men, like male Rangers aren't super tall or super small. They're dense, they're lean. Women are very similar. On average, they're a little bit taller than an average woman, I would say. Not super tiny, but very, very fit. But none of them have been scary. But I haven't seen a lot of the international women. So maybe me, I'm the scary one.
Somebody's going to rip that soundbite and be like, if you want to be an elite woman, do CrossFit.
Well, I'm not saying do CrossFit, but I think they kind of, have that.
Yeah, for sure.
Like
for
they're
sure.
just fit and strong.
Like Alex and I, just really fit looking people. I get it. No, totally understand. Totally understand.
So we've had you for over an hour now. We'll get to close here, but I have to ask an extremely important question before we let you go.
Okay.
Did you test the few on leg tucks?
Yes, because that was when the leg tuck was still in the ACFT.
And what did their performance look like?
I mean, I can send you an awesome video. Their leg tucks were outstanding.
They're tucking, dude.
No, we are gonna need that video.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I feel none of them had a problem with the leg tuck. And I think we had a record, which our commander at the time would actually show the video, which I'll have to send you. But I think she did like 20 leg tucks in like, I think, I don't even know. It was like, I feel like it was like less than 30 seconds. I don't know. It was unbelievable. But they all have this really strong core, which goes back to the whole body composition issue with the old standards, is because it's not an hourglass woman. It's a strong core. So the waist was not helping them because they had their abdomen and their waist were the same. So, just built more like a strong core of a male.
So I don't know who the decision maker on this is. I'm just like speaking to some decision maker out there at the Pentagon or something. But I do know that the FY24 National Defense Authorization Act requires a higher combat standard on the ACFT to be implemented by summer 2025. So whoever you are, decision maker out there, it sounds like the data identifies the leg tuck as a fantastic combat standard.
Don't get me in trouble with CIMT.
No, Holly did not say that. That was me saying
Heard it here first.
Well, thank you. This has been fantastic. I hope we got enough of the body composition and the female elite warfighter stuff in there for people. I'm sure we could go deeper on either if we had more time, but this
And
was
you
awesome.
crushed your first podcast.
Thank you. I
The tour
appreciate it,
starts
guys,
now.
for going easy on me.
Oh, please. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it was great. And, let me know in the future if there's anything that I do that's exciting and interesting. I would be glad to come back.
Thanks for tuning in this week. A fascinating conversation with Holly, someone we've tried to get for a long time. Correct?
This has been for a long time.
For
Actually,
a long time coming.
Instigator of this whole thing, and this had to be 2 years ago now. This had to be like beginning of the podcast. She tuned in to give a talk on, I believe, the ACBC stuff, the body composition part of this whole conversation.
ABCP.
No, ABCP is the program. ACBC is the study.
Army.
I gave you homework to read for this. You already saw it. Army Comprehensive Body Composition Study, ACBC.
ACBCP.
You're welcome.
Yep. Acronyms.
But when she tuned in to give the talk, she had a leg tucknation sticker in the background, like pinned on her desk.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't make it to her some mysterious way. When they were doing the study, I was in fact a subject of the study. They were looking for volunteers at Fort Lee. I drove out there. I brought stickers with me. I gave her a leg tucknation sticker, but
it was in the frame.
I was happy to see that informal endorsement in the background of her talk.
Free advertising. Yeah, so two directions here. Army body composition, obviously huge effort on her part, and then and the female elite warrior. I personally am fascinated by female elite warriors. One, because I love how intimidating men find women who are successful. Maybe that's because I'm a girl dad, but I love watching men freak out when a woman comes on board and just destroys them. So the fact that she's putting a lot of time and energy into that, we mentioned there at the end some of the future initiatives. Off air after the fact, we talked to her about some ways in which we could possibly use our platform to help drive some of that conversation. So certainly stay tuned. But that is just a fascinating area for me.
Yeah, I will say this is a personal story. I won't use any names. Maybe this person will be a guest on the podcast in the future, and then we can share it with names. But one of the first female Ranger graduates was a cadet at the same time as I was. She was a little older than me. She was a year or two ahead or something like that. And she was briefly on the same team as me. And that's more than enough information. I won't provide any more identifying data so they don't track down this person. But I, at the time, didn't like her very much because she acted like she was better than everyone.
Oh.
And with like 5 to 10 years of perspective, looking back on that, I have revised my position. One, she's chilled out a ton since then. I've talked to her plenty. We know each other. We're on good terms. But two, the reason she acted that way is because she was better than all of us.
I was about to ask.
At the time, it hurt my feelings. But now that I have like a little bit of perspective on it, she was just dominating everybody at everything. And I needed to get over that. And that was a me problem, not a her problem.
Yeah, that is a you problem. No, we've mentioned this to Holly, but I think some of our hardest hitting episodes have had to do with, we call them ambitious women in the Army, but female elite warfighter, probably a lot of crossover there.
I think many AWITAs are aspiring to be fews.
Few and proud. I'm proud of us for not dropping proud alongside few, because the opportunities were several. But yeah, I guess
we saved the puns for the outro
of course.
The episode.
In terms of just takeaways for me, again, I go back to, man, it's not that long ago that people thought females would die if they ran marathons. And for a fun little history lesson, you can actually look and see the first woman to complete a marathon, like dressed like a guy.
And had to like dodge people trying to pull her out of the race and stuff.
Yeah, it was a thing, which I think speaks on an existential level to the fact that we didn't necessarily say this specifically, but a lot of these female elite warfighters, in addition to just being like physically dominant, because when you think about men going to Ranger school or selection or whatever, there's the physical component, and sure, there's the grittiness and the mental toughness piece. But I would maintain that a female equivalent to that has an extra layer of challenge added in, which is kind of what you mentioned, this expectation that they should fail because they're female, or they aren't good enough because they're female. And so when we hear stories about either research pursuing some of this or women just being successful in general, again, maybe it's because I'm a girl dad, I fucking love it.
All right. Well, I'll just food for thought for future conversations or something, but I think about this a lot. we have ideas in our head of like what people should be able to perform at based on their age and gender and background and whatever. In the field, you'll hear it referred to as normative values, like a bunch of data collected on a certain demographic of how much they bench press and how fast they run 100 meters and whatever. But all of that is built on like baseline assumptions of like this population is achieving a normal level for that level of intensity or whatever. And I think we don't really have that good an idea of what a normal level of performance for women in the military or women in the Army is. I think we set a certain standard 40 years ago and people settled into that standard and got comfortable there. And so therefore you get the same averages among men and women when you adjust the scoring by whatever percentage. But I think it was just as much driven by the standards as it was driven by the physical potential of men or women. And it'll be really interesting to see as we start to like open these doors into what is really possible when you let people go all out on this kind of stuff. I think we might see a recalibration of what normal expectations are.
Mm-hmm. So with that, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next week. Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.